It began in the summer of 1953, when a faint radio pulse flickered out of the Nevada desert and slipped unnoticed across the world's airwaves. To most listeners it was nothing, just another burst of static lost among the countless shortwave transmissions that filled the ether, but to the trained ears of Soviet monitoring officers stationed along the Pacific frontier, it sounded wrong. The pulse repeated at perfectly timed intervals, its frequency steady, its modulation too deliberate to be the work of weather or cosmic noise. They logged it, triangulated its source somewhere near an unmarked expanse north of Las Vegas, and forwarded their findings to Moscow with a single phrase stamped in red, possible new U.S. system. Inside the Soviet capital, analysts crowded into smoke-filled rooms where the Cold War was measured in decibels and hertz. Each new American signal was treated as a potential weapon, and this one, with its strange, rhythmic structure, suggested purpose. Some believed it was a long-range radar prototype capable of tracking bombers before they reached the pole. Others suspected it was a communications backbone linking nuclear command centers beneath the Rockies. Whatever it was, it did not belong to nature, and that meant it belonged to the enemy. Orders went out to every listening post from Vladivostok to Murmansk: record, decode, and decipher. A mystery frequency had entered the chessboard. Thousands of miles away, the truth was both simpler and far stranger. In a windowless blockhouse buried under the Nevada sun, a handful of American engineers and intelligence officers watched oscilloscopes flicker with satisfaction. Their transmitter array, officially listed as an atmospheric research installation, was in fact the centerpiece of a deception operation authorized by the newly formed CIA and the U.S. Air Force's Scientific Intelligence Division. Their mission was not to reveal power but to invent it, to conjure the illusion of a capability so advanced that the Soviets would spend years and fortunes trying to counter a phantom. They called it, half-jokingly, the Ghost Station. The idea had been born from an uncomfortable realization: in an age defined by nuclear secrecy, perception was as potent as hardware. If Moscow could be persuaded that America possessed over-the-horizon radar technology that could see across continents, then every Soviet flight plan, every bomber formation, every doctrine of surprise attack would collapse under doubt. The beauty of the plan lay in its economy. A few antennas, a bank of oscillators, and an unending broadcast of meaningless code would force an empire to chase shadows. The engineers designed the signal with meticulous artistry. It rose and fell like a breathing creature, its pulses arranged in cycles that mimicked radar sweeps, its silences inserted with mathematical precision to imply data resets. Even the random noise between bursts was sculpted to sound imperfectly human, as though a hidden operator somewhere out in the desert were adjusting knobs and testing calibration. At dusk, when the first full transmission went live, the men sat beneath the humming towers and listened to their creation drift into the ionosphere. To them it was little more than static, to Moscow it would soon resemble a revelation. Within weeks, Soviet intercept stations were alive with activity. Analysts plotted frequency drifts on long paper rolls, believing they traced the heartbeat of a secret American network stretching from Alaska to Florida. Their reports climbed the hierarchy until they reached the desks of generals who saw in the data a threat to the motherland's survival. Funds were redirected toward counter-radar research, new committees formed, new fears ignited. The illusion was working beyond its architect's expectations. In Washington, decrypted fragments of Soviet chatter confirmed the success. The CIA's internal brief noted that enemy technical elements assign high probability to existence of U.S. Continental Early Warning Array. Behind closed doors, a few officials worried that the trick might backfire, that if the Soviets truly believed the United States had achieved such capability, they might accelerate their own nuclear readiness or misread the next crisis as a prelude to war. But the program had momentum now, and secrecy was its armor. No one outside a dozen men would ever know the truth. By autumn, the broadcast had become a permanent ghost in the air, rising each night with the desert heat and fading with dawn. Truckers who happened to tune across the frequency heard only a faint mechanical heartbeat and moved on. Ham operators reported interference without suspecting its origin. The few who did inquire were told it was a meteorological beacon, nothing more. In reality, every pulse carried the weight of strategy. The towers stood silent against the red horizon, transmitting to an adversary that could never be allowed to stop listening. And across the world, in a grey building off Lubyanka Square, Soviet intelligence officers stared at their spectrograms with growing obsession. They charted the invisible architecture of a weapon that did not exist, convinced that in those ghostly waves lay proof of American superiority. They could not know that what they were hearing was the sound of fear itself, engineered, amplified, and echoing endlessly through the static of a world on edge. By the mid-1950s, the Cold War had settled into a rhythm of suspicion. The world had divided into two armed continents glaring across oceans and ideology, each convinced that the other was seconds away from striking first. In Washington, paranoia had become policy. The words national security were invoked to justify everything from spy planes to thought experiments, and the men in the Pentagon's war rooms no longer slept easily. Every strange radar blip, every intercepted signal, every unexplained blip on a seismograph could mean annihilation or salvation. Within that atmosphere, the ghost station's faint heartbeat was not just a deception, it was a symphony played for an audience of generals and analysts who heard threats in silence. To the Americans who built it, the project was insurance, a way to shape the battlefield of perception before any missile ever left its silo. To the Soviets who monitored it, it was proof that their enemy had leapt forward into a future they could barely comprehend. Fear became the common language, and in that language, even lies had power. In Moscow, the reports grew thicker by the month. Scientists from the Radio Technical Institute were summoned to examine the mysterious signal. They brought with them reels of magnetic tape, diagrams of frequency drift, and nervous explanations about phase modulation patterns that seemed to encode something, perhaps range data, perhaps atmospheric returns. The senior officers in attendance didn't fully understand the jargon, but they understood the implication: the Americans might now see across the curvature of the Earth. If true, it would render Soviet bombers obsolete before they left the runway. To counter the threat, the Kremlin authorized a new wave of funding for counterintelligence and radar research. Laboratories in Minsk, Novosibirsk, and Leningrad began working on their own prototypes, desperate to match an invisible technology no one could confirm even existed. Soviet engineers stayed awake through endless nights, drafting circuits on paper that was still damp from the printing press, while outside, the snow fell softly on rooftops lit by the red stars of government buildings. The illusion from Nevada had reached the heart of the Soviet Empire, and it was costing them more than any missile warhead ever could. Meanwhile, the Americans watched with quiet satisfaction. From their offices at Langley and the Pentagon, intelligence officers intercepted reports of the Soviet mobilization. Satellite imagery, still crude in those years, confirmed the construction of massive antenna farms in the Urals. For every dollar spent maintaining the ghost station, the Soviets were spending thousands chasing it. The deception had achieved what even atomic diplomacy could not: it had forced the adversary to fight an enemy made of thin air. But deception, once unleashed, has a way of spreading beyond control. As months turned into years, few remembered exactly who had authorized the original project. The files were buried in nested classifications, the personnel rotated to new departments. Only the transmitter kept speaking, endlessly, faithfully, unaware of the decades it would serve. Even some within the US military began to question its purpose. Radar technicians at nearby bases occasionally stumbled across the signal, assuming it belonged to a classified system they weren't cleared to know about. Requests for clarification vanished into bureaucracy. The ghost station, designed to fool an enemy, was now confusing its own creators. And still, it worked. Soviet interception logs show that by 1958, the signal was listed as high-priority persistent emitter. Analysts nicknamed it the American Eye, a poetic title for a sound that never slept. Each new modulation pattern sent panic rippling through their chain of command. The Kremlin demanded answers from its scientists, the scientists demanded better funding, and the cycle of fear sustained itself without a single bullet fired. In the Nevada desert, the men who once tended the transmitters grew older. Some retired, others moved on to new black projects. Yet the signal endured, an unbroken hum threading through the night, reflecting off the ionosphere and whispering over the Bering Strait. To most Americans, the desert was empty. To the Soviets, it was alive with invisible power. Fear had become the medium of exchange between superpowers, a current that flowed as reliably as electricity. And somewhere within that charged silence, the ghost station pulsed steadily on, a mechanical heartbeat reminding both sides that in the Cold War, the line between truth and illusion was no longer clear, and the static between them was the only thing keeping the world from exploding. By the dawn of the 1960s, the ghost station had become a legend within Soviet intelligence circles, a riddle wrapped in static, known only to those with the right clearance and the patience to listen. In dimly lit rooms across the vast Soviet Union, teams of radio operators huddled over oscilloscopes, headphones pressed tight, recording every pulse from the western deserts of America. They called it Shaya the whisper. The name carried both fascination and dread, for it was said that the Americans had found a way to talk without words, to move commands and coordinates through what appeared to be noise. To the Soviets, that was the future of warfare, invisible, silent, unstoppable. Every week, new reports arrived at the Central Radio Monitoring Bureau in Moscow. The signal's strength fluctuated, its patterns evolving with unnerving precision. Sometimes it grew faint, then surged back as though adjusting itself to the atmosphere. Analysts noticed that changes often coincided with key geopolitical events, the launch of a satellite, a nuclear test, a crisis somewhere in Berlin or Korea. They began to believe the signal was tied directly to U.S. Strategic Command, a kind of encrypted pulse reflecting American readiness. Each pattern shift could mean an alert level, each pause a coded instruction. To the scientists tasked with decoding it, the work was maddening. The transmission refused to yield any logical structure. There were rhythms but no repetition, cycles but no message. One physicist described it as a music without notes, an intelligence designed to disguise itself from human comprehension. And yet, the more elusive it became, the more convinced Moscow grew that it held meaning. In a regime built on suspicion, mystery itself was proof of intent. Meanwhile, in the United States, the deception team was evolving. The original engineers who had built the system were long gone, replaced by younger technicians who inherited a project whose origins were barely explained. The official paperwork referred to it as Atmospheric Data Analysis, Project Echo, a name so bland that no one looked twice. The new caretakers simply followed protocols, maintain power, monitor frequency stability, adjust modulation once a month. They didn't know that their monotonous maintenance fed a psychological operation that had ensnared the Soviet Union for nearly a decade. Within Soviet headquarters, the obsession deepened into institutional paranoia. Entire departments were assigned to counter the whisper. KGB cryptographers pored over miles of printed waveforms, while GRU intelligence officers proposed wild theories, that the signal was mapping the magnetic fields of Soviet missiles, that it carried submarine communication disguised as noise, that it might even be an early form of machine intelligence. The more they speculated, the deeper the ghost reached into their thinking. Then, in October 1962, came the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the whisper erupted into frantic activity. Soviet monitoring posts recorded an unprecedented surge in signal power, accompanied by rapid oscillation bursts never seen before. To them, it was confirmation the Americans were bringing their secret system online, readying for nuclear confrontation. In truth, the Nevada technicians were simply performing a routine calibration, unaware that their harmless adjustments were echoing into one of the most dangerous standoffs in human history. For 13 tense days, both sides teetered on the edge of annihilation. In Moscow, generals shouted for updates. Was the signal rising or falling? Did it indicate launch readiness or retreat? Their analysts could only guess. Each burst of static was treated as prophecy. The ghost had become a heartbeat of fear pulsing across continents. When the crisis ended, Soviet leaders breathed easier, but the fascination remained. They had survived the brink, and still the mysterious American network endured, humming quietly beneath the noise of the world. To them, that persistence proved its importance. No mere research beacon would maintain such discipline for so long. It had to be operational. It had to mean something. By the mid-1960s, the name the Whisper Net appeared in classified Soviet memoranda. It was believed to link radar stations, missile fields, and command centers across the U.S. mainland. Maps were drawn, budgets allocated, research expanded. Every frequency shift from Nevada became a clue to a phantom infrastructure no one had ever seen. The deception had achieved something remarkable. It had given form to fear. A sound that carried no information had built an empire of assumptions, a network of ghosts more influential than any real radar could have been. And in the quiet desert where it all began, the transmitters kept humming in the heat, unaware that their lonely signal had become a legend half a world away. By 1964, the Whisper Net was no longer a mystery confined to analysts' notebooks. It had become a cornerstone of Soviet threat assessments, cited in internal defense briefings as evidence of America's electronic shield. In the minds of Moscow's military planners, it was not just a signal, it was a system, vast, complex, and menacing. Entire budgets were justified in its name. New research divisions appeared overnight, staffed with mathematicians, engineers, and linguists whose sole purpose was to study a sound that meant nothing. The irony was profound. The weapon that didn't exist was now shaping the arsenal of a superpower that believed it must. Inside the Pentagon, the deception's architects could scarcely believe how far it had gone. Reports intercepted through double agents revealed that the Soviets were building enormous antenna arrays in Siberia, structures taller than cathedrals, designed to mirror the supposed American radar network. Billions of rubles were being poured into chasing a phantom. To the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, it was the perfect operation, bloodless, invisible, endlessly productive. Every day the transmitters in Nevada whispered, they drained another drop of Soviet confidence. Yet the longer the game went on, the more fragile it became. Technology was advancing quickly, satellites now orbited the Earth, photography from space was possible, and electronic intelligence was growing too sophisticated to control. The ghost signal, once so believable, risked discovery by America's own allies, or worse, its own departments. Compartmentalization had protected the secret for years, but even secrecy decays. The files were aging, the signatures of the signal no longer matched the cutting-edge American systems it pretended to represent. To keep the illusion alive, the engineers had to evolve it, giving their phantom a heartbeat that mimicked progress. New patterns were introduced, broader sweeps, modulated tones that hinted at digital encoding. The CIA called it phase delta. The Soviets, watching from their own control rooms, interpreted these changes as confirmation that the Americans had upgraded the system. Their paranoia deepened. For every adjustment in Nevada, Moscow restructured a program, redefined a doctrine, or redrew a map of its own air defense grid. The two superpowers were now trapped in a feedback loop of imagination, one transmitting fiction, the other responding with reality. The most dangerous moment came not from the signal itself but from its interpretation. In the spring of 1967, Soviet analysts noticed a sudden and dramatic rise in power output from the ghost station, again, a routine maintenance anomaly, but within the KGB's Operations Directorate, it was viewed as a prelude to activation. If the Americans were preparing to use the system, the logic went, a military crisis might be imminent. That same month, U.S. reconnaissance aircraft reported unusual radar tracking near the Bering Strait. Both sides, acting on illusions, began to shadow each other more aggressively. The static from a handful of towers in the desert had quietly rippled into the geopolitics of deterrence. Washington realized, belatedly, that the deception had acquired momentum beyond its control. The operations handlers proposed quietly discontinuing transmissions, fearing that misinterpretation might one day spark a real confrontation. But within the intelligence bureaucracy, success is a drug. No one wanted to kill an operation that worked. The ghost signal remained on air. It had outlived its original purpose and become an institution unto itself, its existence known only to a few, its influence felt by millions who would never hear it. By the late 1960s, radio operators on both sides of the Iron Curtain treated the whisper net as a fixture of the Cold War soundscape, like the hum of power lines or the ticking of clocks. It had become part of the background, a noise that defined an era. And yet, in those faint, coded bursts lay a dangerous truth, that the Cold War was no longer fought only with weapons, but with perception. Each side believed it was listening to the other, when in truth, both were only hearing echoes of themselves. The Americans transmitted fear, the Soviets amplified it. And somewhere between those frequencies, invisible to history's naked eye, the world remained balanced on the edge of misunderstanding. By the early 1970s, the world had changed, but the ghost signal had not. It still pulsed softly across the shortwave bands, steady as a heartbeat, rising from the Nevada desert where dust gathered on the old transmitter housings and sand had long since buried the tire tracks of the men who built it. Most of those who had conceived the deception were gone, retired, reassigned, or dead, and their secret had drifted into bureaucratic obscurity. Yet the transmitters remained faithful, humming through the heat, their purpose forgotten by all but a handful of people whose signatures lay buried in sealed archives. It was into this fog of institutional memory that a young U.S. Air Force signals officer named Richard Hall stumbled one quiet night in 1972. Hall was 28, newly posted to a communication security unit outside Omaha, and his job was as tedious as it was essential: monitor radio spectrums for anomalies that might suggest espionage or system leaks. The Cold War had entered its electronic age, and vigilance was a virtue. One evening, while scanning the high-frequency band, Hall noticed a faint, repetitive tone pattern that didn't fit any known broadcast. Curious, he logged it and cross-checked against his database of friendly signals. Nothing matched. At first he assumed it was foreign, a Soviet test, perhaps, or even Chinese telemetry, but the direction of arrival told a stranger story. The signal originated from within U.S. borders, bouncing eastward across the continent. Hall recalibrated his instruments, ran a bearing sweep, and stared in disbelief. The the source appeared to be somewhere in southern Nevada, near the coordinates of an old Air Force testing range long since closed to the public. He recorded a full minute of audio, noting its peculiar consistency, and prepared a report for his commanding officer. The next morning, Hall's superior glanced at the printout and frowned. The coordinates triggered an alert in his memory, a project name he couldn't discuss. He thanked Hall for his diligence and told him, curtly, that the anomaly was classified atmospheric research. The explanation made no sense, but the tone ended the conversation. 2 days later, Hall's workstation was inspected by security officers who quietly removed his logs and tapes. When he asked why, they replied with the same calm dismissal that defines true secrecy: "You're not cleared for that frequency." But curiosity, once awakened, does not surrender easily. Hall confided his confusion to a colleague, wondering aloud how a signal inside U.S. territory could operate under such mystery. Together they tuned in again late one night, listening through the static to that slow, deliberate pulse. It sounded like something alive, steady, patient, indifferent to time. They speculated half-seriously that it might be a navigation beacon or a deep space experiment. They could not know that they were hearing the dying heartbeat of a deception older than both of them. Word of Hall's curiosity reached higher up the chain of command, and soon, the old files began to stir. Deep within the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, a few veterans of the original Ghost Station project realized that their forgotten operation was resurfacing. A memo circulated through Langley in the spring of 1973, recommend review of Project Echo transmission. Compromise risk increasing. For the first time in 2 decades, the phantom signal had drawn attention, not from Moscow, but from Washington itself. Inside the Pentagon, opinions were divided. Some argued the operation had outlived its usefulness. The Soviets now had real over-the-horizon radar, rendering the deception redundant. Others insisted that cutting it abruptly might look suspicious if the Russians were still monitoring. The discussion dragged on in coded meetings, while the transmitters continued to broadcast as if unaware that their own masters were debating whether to silence them. For Hall, the incident ended abruptly. He was reassigned to a new post within weeks, given no explanation and no chance to ask questions. His colleagues noticed the change. His curiosity had been erased by transfer orders. Somewhere in the desert, the signal carried on, steady as ever. The illusion that had once defined a generation of strategists was now haunting a new one, a secret too old to remember yet too sensitive to die. In a world where information had become both weapon and currency, the most dangerous thing was not ignorance but half-knowledge. And in 1973, America was beginning to realize that its greatest ghost might soon start whispering back. By the spring of 1974, the hum that had haunted Soviet receivers for more than 20 years began to fade. There was no official order, no announcement, no ceremony. The decision came quietly, buried inside a stack of internal memoranda stamped eyes only. After months of debate, the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology finally agreed that the signal had outlived its usefulness. The deception had done its work. It had drained budgets, fueled paranoia, and rewritten strategies on the other side of the world. But now, in an age of satellites and surveillance planes, it was becoming a liability. The ghost was no longer invisible. It was time to let it die. In the Nevada desert, a skeleton crew of engineers received the shutdown directive. Most of them had no idea what the transmission truly represented. They only knew that the old towers, battered by wind and dust, were being decommissioned. One by one, they powered down the transmitters, listening as the static dwindled into silence. When the last generator stopped, a faint crackle lingered in the air, like the echo of something vast collapsing into itself. Outside, the desert wind took over the frequency. For the first time in 2 decades, the spectrum went quiet. Thousands of miles away, in a radio monitoring station outside Murmansk, a Soviet technician leaned toward his headphones and frowned. The pulse he had tracked since his first year of service, steady, unwavering, a fixture of the Cold War, was gone. He checked his instruments, recalibrated, listened again. Nothing. Just the soft hiss of atmospheric noise. His supervisor joined him, equally puzzled. Perhaps maintenance, the man muttered, though neither believed it. They logged the disappearance and transmitted a report to Moscow, primary US frequency 12.67 megacycles inactive as of 0400 hours. Cause unknown. For months, Soviet analysts searched the airwaves for its return. They shifted antennas, scanned adjacent bands, and waited for the whisper to come back. But the sky remained silent. In internal briefings, generals debated what the silence meant. Some feared it signaled the Americans had completed whatever system the signal once masked, that it had gone operational. Others believed it had migrated to higher frequencies, perhaps transmitted by satellites now orbiting unseen. No one dared suggest the simplest explanation, that there had never been a system at all. Years later, after the Cold War thawed and the archives of both nations began to creak open, fragments of the truth surfaced. Former CIA officers spoke in cautious tones about an acoustic misdirection project, a relic from an era when illusion had been as valuable as steel. A few Soviet veterans, upon hearing those accounts, laughed in disbelief, then in embarrassment. One KGB analyst, interviewed in the 1990s, admitted that entire departments had been built around the study of the whisper net. "We thought it was the crown jewel of their defense," he said. "It turns out we were defending ourselves from an empty sky." For the men who had tended the transmitters, the revelation brought mixed feelings. Some took pride in the brilliance of the trick, how a handful of towers and a few lines of code had tilted the psychology of global power. Others felt a lingering unease, as if they had tampered with the balance of fear and luck that had kept the world from burning. "It worked too well," one retired engineer said decades later. "You can build a weapon from lies, but you can't control where the truth will ricochet." Today, the site of the ghost station lies abandoned, its towers rusted, its equipment stripped by time and storms. A few foundations remain, half buried in sand, pointing toward a sky once filled with invisible voices. Hikers who pass through the restricted lands north of Groom Lake sometimes find fragments of copper wire or broken insulators and wonder what they were for. They could never guess that, from this lonely desert, a phantom once whispered across the world and held 2 superpowers in thrall. In the end, the signal achieved something no missile ever could. It proved that fear itself could be engineered, that the most powerful weapon of the Cold War was not a bomb or a rocket, but belief. The ghost station was switched off, but its echo never truly stopped. It lives on in the code wars, the disinformation campaigns, and the invisible battles of the digital age.